Thank you, Father. It's a real honor to address you all here in paradise. I wanted to get Johnny Garone laughing when he was driving me here, so I looked out the window and I said, "What a dump! People living in boats. What are these shacks looking at the ocean?" So it really is. It's a wonderful place. Too bad you have a governor that's determined to turn it into hell on earth. So my talk is on the importance of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the modern world. And I think we have to think today, as we celebrate or commemorate the Feast of the Assumption, her prophecy. And behold, henceforth all generations will call me blessed. Even this generation that calls itself the modern world. Well, what is the modern world? The liberal mind, the radical liberal, seeks directionality in history. He wants to think there's some sort of intrinsic dynamism that led to the overthrow of kings and the overthrow of Catholic social order and the advent of modern pluralist democracy. And you have philosophers like Hegel who say the world spirit assists absolute spirit in coming to an awareness of itself through revolutions. So Hegel thought that human history had ended for all practical purposes at the Battle of Jena during the French Revolutionary Wars, because that meant the end of monarchy. And so now the absolute spirit realized that the proper arrangement for things in the world politically was going to be liberal democracy. But I can give you in a few landmarks that I can sum up in 30 seconds the whole progress of the development of the modern world, which begins with bad philosophy, or bad religion, I should say. From there, bad philosophy, and then the age of democratic revolution. So you start with patient zero, Martin Luther, in 1517. Then you have in 1649 the assassination or the execution of Charles I by his own subjects. One commentator said, I forget his name, he said, the monarchy can survive 1,000 assassinations, but not one execution. Once you decide that the subjects can execute the king, you've unleashed the furies of hell on the face of the earth. And then in 1688, the Glorious Revolution. At the same time, you have the philosophy, the bad philosophy, of Locke and Hobbes on the social contract theory. And then from there, you have the first practical revolution, 1776 in America, the first secular state ever created on the face of the earth, whose constitution makes no reference to God, an original sin of this country, as a movement of Protestants noted in the 1860s, called the National Reform Association. They wanted the Constitution to be amended, believe it or not, Protestants, to recognize the social kingship of Christ. They failed. It was tabled in Congress. And then, of course, 1789, the French Revolution, the French Revolutionary Wars, 1792 to 1802, the European revolutions of 1848, the Latin American revolutions, all Masonically influenced. Perhaps the culmination was the assassination of Gabriel Garcia Moreno, who restored Ecuador to Catholic social order and predicted his own assassination by the Masons. And in a letter he wrote to Pope Pius IX. And then the Paris Commune in 1871. It was crushed by the so-called moderate republic, leading to this dynamic we see today. The bourgeoisie of socialism versus the party of order, the Republicans or the Democrats. Far removed from our consideration any longer as anything like Catholic social order, and certainly not monarchy. And then, of course, you have 1917, the definitive end of Christendom with the collapse of the House of Habsburg after World War I. And this is where Our Lady of Fatima comes into play, where the importance of Our Lady for the modern world becomes evident. It's as if God said, enough of this! Now we're going to have a world event in terms of Marian apparitions. Not just a local apparition like Our Lady of Good Success in Quito, Ecuador, but a world event. An event that even the world will have to recognize, because the time has come for a very dramatic divine intervention in this modern world. And what do we mean by the modern world? We mean simply a world that is no longer Catholic, in which Catholic social order has been definitively exterminated. One commentator puts it this way: the emancipation of the body politic from the Catholic Church. And Pope Leo, in his encyclical on the Christian Constitution of States, Immortale Dei, says when you cut off the relation between church and state, you are severing the relation between the body politic and its soul, and what you get, a rotting corpse. And that's what we're living in today, even if, thanks to the political miracle of Trump's re-election, we can roll back the tendency somewhat. He helps us inch back from the abyss, for now at least. But Fatima is a world event to remind the world that there is a heaven, there is judgment. Death, judgment, heaven, and hell are the ultimate realities. And when I say it's a world event, I mean even the world recognizes it. So, for example, in the Washington Post on October 13, 2017, we read the following historical account. The children, speaking of the Fatima children, this is the Washington Post, were tending a flock of sheep outside the tiny village of Fatima, Portugal, when they first saw the angel. He was transparent, they said, and shining like a crystal. Lucia, her cousins Jacinta and Francisco were stunned. During the rest of 1916, as World War I raged in Europe, the angel showed himself 2 more times to the children. This is all very accurate, and it's in the Washington Post. In the spring of 1917, something more extraordinary began unfolding. Visions that would put the 3 children on the path to sainthood and transform Fatima from an ordinary village to the site of a Catholic shrine venerated and visited by millions. The Virgin Mary appeared to the children on May 13, 1917, as, quote, a lady dressed in white, shining brighter than the sun, giving out rays of clear and intense light, Dos Santos wrote. She promised to come to the children on the 13th of each month. In the Washington Post only 8 years ago. Now, if you do a search for July 13, 1917, on Google, the AI search result will give only the following date for that query. On July 13, 1917, this is AI telling us this, the 3rd apparition of Our Lady of Fatima occurred, where the Virgin Mary revealed 3 secrets to the shepherd children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, in the village of Fatima, Portugal. This event is significant in Catholic tradition as it included a vision of hell and a call for devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary to prevent the spread of communism and bring peace to the world. So says the Oracle of All Truth, Google. If you go to the website on this day, it's an historical website, search website, type in a day, it gives you what happened on that day. Only 2 events pop up on the date of October 13, 1917. One date is the miracle of the sun. The other date is the establishment of the Petrograd Military Directorate in Moscow. Now, on that date, with the establishment of that directorate, the mobilizing force of the October Revolution was in place. The so-called moderate February Revolution would be overturned by the Bolsheviks, and the horror of communism would be unleashed upon the world. Listen to this account, continuing in the Washington Post, same article I quoted earlier, of the miracle of the sun. On that day, the crowd of believers had swelled to 70,000. At 2 p.m. noon solar time, as the Virgin had promised. This is a very important precision that we make. Father Bruno always said this. Some people said it was delayed, she was late. No, it was noon solar time. The Washington Post picks this up. All of the assembled began to see what later became known in the Catholic Church as the miracle of the sun. The rains that had plagued the day ceased, and the sun emerged from behind clouds to spin and tremble for 10 minutes. Before the astonished eyes of the crowd, whose aspect was biblical as they stood bareheaded, eagerly searching the sky, the sun trembled, made sudden incredible movements outside all cosmic laws. The sun danced, according to the typical expression of the people, reported El Secolo, the Lisbon newspaper, run by Masons and atheists. The strange phenomenon included odd colors, the Washington Post goes on to say. Looking at the sun, quoting one of the witnesses, I noticed that everything was becoming darkened. I looked first at the nearest objects, and then extended my gaze further afield as far as the horizon. I saw everything had assumed an amethyst color. Objects around me, the sky and the atmosphere were of the same color. Everything both near and far had changed, taking on the color of old yellow damask, said Jose Maria de Almeida, a science professor from Coimbra, Portugal. No person as far as 25 miles away noted the strange phenomena in the sky. So, what we have here is a description of the miracle of the sun in a secular newspaper only 8 years ago as just one evidence of how Fatima is a world event. And the Washington Post gives a lot of details on the miracle of the sun, which accord exactly with our understanding of it and our historiography regarding this event. Here's what the Washington Post says. The sun appeared to dance, zigzag, or whirl in the sky. The sun seemed to advance toward Earth. The sun emitted multicolored light and radiant colors. The sun appeared pale and did not hurt the eyes. The sun appeared as a disk with a clean-cut rim, luminous and shining. The sun seemed to loose itself from the sky, about to hurtle down upon us like a wheel of flame. A howling wind began to blow. The rain-soaked people were suddenly dry, and their clothes clean. The ground was completely dry. This was considered to be one of the most credible examples of a modern miracle. That latter part, the most credible examples of a modern miracle, is what you get if you do a Wikipedia search on the date of the miracle of the sun. Even Hollywood had to pay tribute to the event with the movie, maybe you know it, The Miracle of Our Lady of Fatima, Warner Brothers, 1952. There was even a review of the film in the New York Times. And here's what the New York Times reviewer said about it. It's a spiritual document for the faithful and a serious but unspectacular drama for others. But it got a movie review in the New York Times because the whole world took that event seriously, even the secular press. And as we all know, a separate story, I'll touch upon it here, everyone was waiting for the disclosure of the third secret of Fatima in 1960. That aspect of the world event was known to non-Catholics. It was even a TV show based on the upcoming revelation of the third secret in 1960. And we know, of course, that it didn't happen for reasons, again, I'll touch on. Now, during the reign of Pius XI, the Fatima prophecies conveyed to the three seers on July 13, the great secret, would be fulfilled to the letter, confirming the intersection of human history with a divine intervention authenticated for the skeptical world by the pre-announced solar miracle, acknowledged even by the Washington Post only 8 years ago. And then, of course, the February Revolution, as I noted earlier, gave way to the October Revolution, which began 13 days after the miracle of the sun at Fatima. Now, in 1922, the first year of Pius XI's reign, the Soviet Union was formed from the Russian and Transcaucasian Soviet Federated Socialist Republics and the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republics. And in that same year, the exiled Karl I, the Austrian monarch, died of the Spanish flu along with two of the seers on the Portuguese island of Madeira. That's where he went when he was exiled. 2 years earlier, the two seers, Francisco and Jacinta, died during the same flu epidemic. And I think it's fitting indeed that the last Catholic monarch would meet an early death in the same country where the lady dressed in white had appeared to forewarn of a global catastrophe, and I quote her, "if people do not cease offending God." Now, by the time of Pius XI's election, Russia, via the Comintern, the Communist International, had already begun to spread her errors throughout the world, just as the Virgin had predicted. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was formed, with the assistance of the Russian Communist Party and the Far Eastern Bureau of the Comintern. The Chinese Communists had drawn their inspiration from the triumph of the Bolsheviks 4 years earlier. Li Dazhao co-founder of the Chinese Communist Party, would become the mentor of Mao Zedong, whose great leap forward would result in the genocide of some 76 million Chinese due to starvation, imprisonment, and execution. Now, as if to confirm that the Fatima prophecy that Russia would spread her errors throughout the world, Pius XI lamented in his encyclical Divini Redemptoris, quote, "The rapid diffusion of the communistic ideas now seeping into every nation, great and small, advanced and backward, so that no corner of the earth is free from them." No corner of the earth is free from them. And he cited two national examples. The obvious one, Russia, but also Mexico. And we'll go into the whole history of communist influence in Mexico. Suffice it to say that the communists established a beachhead in Mexico and were assisting the Masonic government of Mexico in brutally persecuting Catholics in the Catholic Church. And in Divini Redemptoris, Pius summed up with admirable conciseness the role of communist ideology in the twin national tragedies of Mexico and Spain. And I'm quoting him here. According to this doctrine, the communist doctrine, there is in the world only really matter, the blind forces which evolve into plant, animal, and man. Even human society is nothing but a phenomenon and form of matter, evolving in the same way. By a law of inexorable necessity and through a perpetual conflict of forces, matter moves toward the final synthesis of a classless society, and in such a doctrine as is evident, there is no room for the idea of God. And this is what I mentioned at the outset, this radical liberal idea of an immanentized internal dynamism of history, the world spirit, if you have a theistic view of this. It's really a pantheistic view, driving the whole world toward what we see today as if it were somehow inevitable. What it really is the work of murderers, liars, and thieves who overthrew or executed or exiled kings and anyone else who stood in their way. It was not a dynamic of history. It was a dynamic of deliberate rebellion against the order of altar and throne. Now, on January 25th, 1938, as the pontificate of Pius XI was nearing its end, the world witnessed precisely what the Virgin had predicted in 1917, a night illumined by an unknown light that would be, she said, and I quote, "the great sign given you by God that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, famine, and persecutions of the Church and of the Holy Father." What the world saw, again, Fatima being a world event, was an extraordinary aurora borealis, a massive geomagnetic storm visible throughout the northern hemisphere on that date. Go to Wikipedia once again, and here's what Wikipedia says about this event. And I quote, "The 25-26 January 1938 geomagnetic storm, also titled the Fatima Storm, was a massive solar storm which occurred 16 to 26 January with peak activity on 22, 25, and 26 January. As the electrification of Europe and North America was still in its infancy, the light storm could be seen brilliantly. The intensely bright arches of crimson light with a shifting spectrum of green, blue, white, and red radiated from a brilliant auroral crown near the zenith, instead of appearing as usual in parallel lines." So the aurora borealis is unusual, but this was unusual even among the aurora. The aurora is believed by many people, especially those of the Catholic faith, to be related to the Fatima prophecies. End quote. Pius XI would die within 2 weeks of that event, and he would be succeeded by his Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, as Pius XII. 10 days after the aurora, Hitler annexed Austria, the Anschluss. That was the beginning of World War II, or at least the cusp of the war. And in the process, the Catholic confessional state that had been established by Engelbert Dollfuss under the Dollfuss Concordat of 1933 ended with Dollfuss's assassination by Nazi agents. Again, this is how the moderns call liberty was achieved. Murder, rebellion, lies, treachery by a minority. This was not a historical movement of people yearning to be free. It was always the result of a diabolical rebellion by a few against what was once Christendom. And then, of course, with the end of World War II, as we approach the end, we see the accords with Stalin at Tehran and Yalta. Tehran in 1943, Yalta in February of 1945, in which the West allied with one tyrant sprung from the soil of liberated Europe in order to defeat the other, who had sprung from the soil of Eastern Europe. The Janus-headed specter of tyranny, directly the result of the overthrow of Catholic social order. A long process, which we can't go into here, but I certainly sketched it for you. Now, in the decline of Britain as a world power, this is interesting. A.N. Wilson says, and I quote, "The tragedy of the 20th century is that in order to defeat Hitler, Churchill believed it was not merely necessary, but desirable to ally himself to Stalin." Now, there is speculation, legitimate speculation by historians such as Pat Buchanan, that if we had not allied ourselves with Stalin, the world might have been a much better place. The speculation goes as follows. Hitler, rather than Stalinist Russia, might have dominated Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary. In time, Hitler might have been overthrown by a decent group of Germans, so that millions upon millions of lives might have been saved, end quote. But what happened instead literally was the case that the world was made safe for communism. And the prophecy of Fatima was fulfilled. It wasn't Nazism that triumphed, that spread its errors throughout the world, but communism. And the West, in allying itself with Stalin, made that possible. Now, Wilson says, well, it was a sense of decency on Churchill's part that forced him to ally with Stalin to beat Hitler. But that can't excuse the outcome that the world which was supposedly being made safe for democracy had been made safe for communism. The perfect fulfillment of the Fatima prophecy. And I quote that again, that Russia would spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars and persecutions of the church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, various nations will be annihilated. And this is all owing to the fact that, as Robert Nisbet put it, there was an alliance with the Bolshevik butcher, so that when Hitler turned on Stalin, his accomplice in the rape of Poland, by the way, let's not forget, Hitler and Stalin together partitioned Poland, Churchill invited Stalin into the camp of the saints in the words that might have been addressed to a Pericles or a George Washington. So in short, during the pontificate of Pius XII, the world witnessed the horrific fulfillment of the Fatima prophecy, that a worse war would come and that Russia would spread its errors throughout the world. And just as Our Lady had predicted, Pius XII did indeed have much to suffer. But here's what we have to say about Pius XII. Amidst the maelstrom of death and destruction unleashed after more than a century of revolution against the church and the social order it had engendered, Pope Pacelli did more than any single man alive to eliminate or alleviate the suffering of others. I'll mention this in passing, but I develop it in the second volume of this book I wrote on this phenomenon called liberty. I mentioned in passing what Pope Pacelli did for the Jews, and I show extensively in this second volume of my work how Pius XII was acknowledged by Jews, prominent Jewish sources, to have saved vastly more Jews than the Jews did. Honest commentary by these people, which I set forth in this second volume, destroys the libel of Pius XII as complicit somehow in the Holocaust. But in any event, in 1950, Pius XII proclaims the dogma that we commemorate today, the dogma of the Assumption. And if we're talking about the importance of Our Lady in the modern world, and in particular, the world event of Fatima, we have to know that in the days surrounding his promulgation of the dogma of the Assumption, he personally witnessed the miracle of the sun. And I'm quoting from his handwritten notes. "I have seen the miracle of the sun. This is the pure truth," he wrote. And those handwritten notes were put on display in the Vatican archives. Here's what he said at length, quoted in the National Catholic Register. "I was awestruck by a phenomenon that before now I had never seen. The sun, which was still quite high, looked like a pale, opaque sphere, entirely surrounded by a luminous circle. He said he could look at it without the slightest bother. It was a very light little cloud in front of it. And the Pope also said that the sun moved outward slightly after spinning or moving from left to right and vice versa," end quote. And he said that he saw this same miracle again on October 31st and November 1st, the day of the definition of the dogma of the Assumption. And then again on November 8th, quoting him, and after that he said, "No more." And he took it as a divine sign, endorsing the proclamation of the dogma. And he proclaimed the dogma exactly 33 years after the first Fatima apparition. And we know from commentaries and historical studies that Pius XII was the first pope to publicly name and promote Fatima. And this he would be echoed by every successive pope except, as we shall see, John the 23rd, who suppressed the third secret of Fatima and never spoke of Fatima publicly, at least as far as I know. And then in 1950 we have this development from Pius XII, the encyclical Humani Generis. This is a landmark document in the history of the Church before the Second Vatican Council. In it, he condemned all of the errors that he could see emerging everywhere in the Church. He condemned an Irenicism, according to which, and I'm quoting him, "By setting aside the questions which divide men, we aim not only at joining forces to repel the attacks of atheism, but also at reconciling things opposed to one another in the field of dogma." Does that sound familiar? That's the program today of the Vatican. Then he says in the same encyclical, "Some want to reduce to a minimum the meaning of dogmas and to free dogma itself from the terminology long established in the Church and from philosophical concepts held by Catholic teachers." And then he targeted contempt for scholastic philosophy. How deplorable it is, he said, that this philosophy, received and honored by the Church, is scorned by some, who shamelessly call it outmoded in form and rationalistic, as they say. And he also says that what had to be condemned in his time, during his pontificate, was the idea that sacred scripture is infallible, immune from error, and I quote, "only as to those parts of the Bible that treat of God or moral and religious matters," end quote. In other words, it's filled with historical errors. This is what the historical critical method was trying to show. In that aspect of the modernist uprising, he was trying to suppress after Pius X had done so. Now it was resurging. And some say, he says in this encyclical, they are not bound by the doctrine explained in our encyclical letter of a few years ago, Mystici Corporis, and based on the sources of revelation, which teaches that the mystical body of Christ and the Roman Catholic Church are one and the same thing. That doctrine has been completely ignored over the past 60 years. And then to sum up, the attitude that prevails in the Church today, he talks about the false Irenicism, which says that the dissident and the erring can be brought back to the bosom of the Church if the whole truth found in the Church is not sincerely taught to all without corruption or diminution. That's the ecumenical movement. We hide the truth and pretend that we can have unity without a total and integral acceptance of what the Church teaches. Now, Romano Amerio, in his book Iota Una, which is an absolute masterpiece, you must read it, he gives us a profound analysis of Humani Generis. And here's what he says. He says Pius XII wrote it because the problem that was once exterior to the church, ab extra, from outside the church, now comes ab intra. It is no longer a case of an external assault, but of an intestine evil. No longer an attempt to demolish the church, but in the famous phrase of Paul VI, a self-demolition of the church, which intimates what I'm going to discuss momentarily, the third secret of Fatima. Pius XII would confide to Cardinal Ruffini that he had promulgated Humani Generis because, and I quote him, everything was being lost. Everything. He could see it coming. Now, he saw something else before Divini Redemptoris. Maybe you've heard of this prophecy, but I'm going to quote it in full. When he was still Secretary of State, Cardinal Pacelli, under Pius XI, he had a conversation recorded in his biography, Pius XII Before History. I have the French original. I've translated it myself. I know it to be accurate. Suppose, dear friend, he said to his friend, Count Galeazzi, during this conversation, that communism is only the most visible, the organs of subversion against the church and the tradition of divine revelation. Thus, we will witness the invasion of everything that is spiritual. Philosophy, science, law, teaching, the arts, the media, literature, theater, and religion. I am concerned, more precisely worried, about the confidences of the Virgin to the little Lucia of Fatima. This persistence of Our Lady in the face of the danger that threatens the church is a divine warning against the suicide that the alteration of the faith in its liturgy, its theology, and its soul would represent. I hear all around me, he said this in 1931, 31 years before the council. I hear all around me innovators who wish to dismantle the sacred chapel, destroy the universal flame of the church, reject her ornaments, make her remorseful for her historical past. Well, my dear friend, I'm convinced that the Church of Peter must affirm her past, or else she will dig her own grave. I will fight this battle with the greatest energy on the inside of the church, just as outside of it, even if the forces of evil may one day take advantage of my person, my actions, or my writings, as they try today to deform the histories of the church. And that is exactly what they did, by the way. They took a couple of his encyclicals, including Mystici Corporis and Humani Generis, and twisted them into an endorsement of modernism. His own words would indeed be used against him. So he seems to have known something about the third secret of Fatima as early as 1931. And then in 1952, he sends Father Schweigel to Fatima to interrogate Sister Lucia. Perhaps we have all heard this, but we need to remind ourselves of it. Father Schweigel revealed the secret consists of two parts. The first part, he said, relates to the Pope. That's the vision we saw, published in 2000, a Pope being executed outside a devastated city. But the second part, he said, and I must say nothing about its contents, is the logical continuation of the words in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved. So we know there's a text about a dogmatic crisis outside of Portugal that we have yet to see. It's obvious, especially obvious when they trotted out Cardinal Sodano to explain what the vision means, the vision published in 2000. Cardinal Sodano, the Oracle of Fatima? I don't think so. So, in 1952, his commitment to Fatima was such that he attempted a consecration of the world, or rather of Russia. Russia specifically. He actually did single out Russia, and Russia alone, in his apostolic letter, Sacro Vergente Anno, in which he declared, therefore we, in order that our and your prayers may be more easily answered, and in order to give you a special attestation of our benevolence, in the same way as a few years ago we consecrated the entire world to the Immaculate Heart of the Virgin Mother of God. Notice, He has consecrated the world. Someone told him, you better consecrate Russia. So now he's going to do just that. He goes on to say, so now, in a very special way, we consecrate all peoples of Russia to the very same Immaculate Heart, and the safe confidence that with the extremely powerful protection of the Virgin Mary, the wishes expressed by us, by you, and by every good person, for true and fraternal concord and peace, and due freedom for everyone and for the Church in the first place, may be answered as soon as possible. The problem was that the bishops did not participate in this act, which Our Lady had specified, and Sister Lucia made this clear again and again, had to be a collegial act of the College of Bishops together with the Pope, and for reasons that remain mysterious, not a single Pope since then has been able to pull it off. Why? I don't know. We even have the last occupant of the throne of Peter with his attempt. And here's what he consecrated. He consecrated ourselves, the Church, all humanity, especially Russia and Ukraine, immediately thereafter the Russia-Ukraine conflict massively escalated because he didn't single out Russia. That was heaven's answer, an escalation of that war. I had a joke about this, looking at all these ceremonies in which no pope seems willing, perhaps on the advice of advisors, to just simply consecrate Russia. Why don't we just have an omnibus ceremony consecrating every blessed thing in the world except Russia? That would solve their problem. So in 1958, Pius dies, and then 4 years later, the deluge. Everything he saw, everything he feared, begins to happen. John the 23rd becomes Pope. He suppresses the third secret in 1960 because he must have his council. And he says the third secret, which he read, doesn't apply to the years of my pontificate. And then he loses control of the first conciliar session. It's very much like the Estates General in 1789. The Third Estate comes to Paris and says, guess what? Monarch, we are now the National Assembly. And we are now a constitutional republic. Wouldn't be long before the king meets his fate at the guillotine. So he loses control of the gathering. He had these traditional schemas prepared, very Thomistically oriented. He issued an encyclical months before the Council, Veterum Sapientia, in which he demanded a restoration of Latin in all departments of the Church, especially in the liturgy. And he wrote, and I'm quoting almost verbatim, "Let no innovator dare to tamper with the use of Latin in the sacred rites." And that's exactly what they proceeded to do. They destroyed the Latin liturgy. How did they do this? Well, they took control of the council by seizing the microphone, as we've all read. Cardinal Leonard says, we need different drafting commissions. We need to vote for people on these commissions, not the ones the Vatican put in place. And we need to have our own input into what the council documents will be. What date was it that he seized the microphone? October 13, 1962, the anniversary of the miracle of the sun. And so Paul VI takes over, presides over the auto-demolition of the church. Now, Paul VI was a product of the liberal bourgeois of Italian society. They were all in favor of the unification of Italy and the revolution that produced it, the violence, the bloodshed, the fake referendum of 1861. They loved it all. They were great patriotic Italians. It's great to live in a unified Italy if you have a city house and a country house, which the Montinis did. He was living it up. And he was the disciple of none other than Jacques Maritain, whose political theory is absolutely horrific. It's the Americanist idea. History ordains liberal democracy. The sacral age is over. There must no longer be Catholic monarchies or Catholic confessional states. We can only be the leaven of some mythical society where somehow it will be Christian without actually being Christian. Utter nonsense. And Saul Alinsky was bosom buddies with Jacques Maritain. And Jacques Maritain arranged a meeting between Saul Alinsky and Paul VI. 3 meetings, in fact, in Rome. And what did Saul Alinsky say afterwards? This was before we knew who the new pope would be after the death of John the 23rd. And Alinsky said, I don't know who the new pope's going to be, but if it's Paul VI, the drinks will be on me for years to come. Now, what is the problem with Vatican II? Before we get into any details, which are not the subject of today, let me just summarize in one word. Optimism is the problem of Vatican II. A fatuous optimism, a stupid optimism about the modern world. Exactly the false Irenicism that Pius XII had fretted about. And the result was a disaster. The conciliar attitude was openness to the world, optimism about the modern world, the wonders of technology. The beginning of the Dignitatis Humanae document on religious liberty begins with this whopper. Contemporary man is increasingly conscious of the dignity of the human person. Really, in 1962. Contemporary man had already lost sight of the dignity of the human person by 1962. And so disaster ensues. Everything begins falling apart. Remember, Pius XII said, I wrote Divine Redemptoris, or rather, Humani Generis, because everything was being lost. Everything was being lost by 1968 or 1967. And Paul VI begins to admit this. Where is the first place Paul VI admits that disaster was underway? Fatima. On May 13, 1967, he makes a pilgrimage to Fatima. And here is what he says about the state of the church only 2 years after the conclusion of Vatican II. Quote, the Ecumenical Council has awakened many energies within the church. I'll say, has opened broader visions in the field of her doctrine, meaning doctrinal latitudinarianism, which he won't admit, has called all her children to a clearer conscience. No, it didn't. To a more intimate collaboration. No, that didn't happen. To a more active apostolate. He's deluded. But then he goes on to say, it is our concern that such a benefit and such a renewal be preserved and increased. But here comes the admission. What harm would it be if an arbitrary interpretation, not authorized by the magisterium of the church, were to turn this awakening into a disquieting dissolution of her traditional and constitutional structure, were to replace the theology of the true and great masters with new and particular ideologies intended to remove from the norm of faith what modern thought, often devoid of rational light, does not understand and does not like, and were to change the apostolic anxiety and redemptive charity into acquiescence in the negative forms of profane mentality and worldly custom. What a disappointment our effort at universal rapprochement would be if it did not offer to our Christian brothers still divided from us, and to humanity deprived of our faith in its pure authenticity and original beauty, the heritage of truth and charity of which the church is the custodian and dispenser. End quote. So he admits these in the midst of a catastrophe in Fatima as early as 1967. And then in 1968, he says this to the seminarians at Lombardy. The church is going through a moment of disquieting self-criticism. One might even say self-demolition. It is like an acute and complete complex interior upheaval which no one could have expected after the council. Really? Pius XII certainly expected that something like that would happen if an ecumenical council were called, which is why he killed the idea. So less than 3 years after the council, he's in a panic at this point over doctrinal and structural dissolution. There was the heretical Dutch catechism, the Dutch schism, the modernists that John the 23rd had rehabilitated and allowed to draft conciliar documents were running amok all over the place, spreading all kinds of new theological errors. He didn't know what to do. So what did he do? He got in touch with his teacher, Jacques Maritain. Because by this point, even Maritain was having doubts. And I'm quoting Maritain from his Peasant of the Garonne. The present crisis has many diverse aspects. What crisis? Well, wasn't Vatican II a great renewal? He goes on to say, one of the most curious spectacles it offers us is a kind of kneeling before the world, which is revealed in 1,000 ways, end quote. He didn't see any kneeling before the world before 1962. Now suddenly, everyone in the church is kneeling before the world. So he contacts Maritain for assistance. with the cradle of the people of God, which I'll get to in a moment. But I should note that Maritain wrote to his homosexual friend, Julian Green, in the very midst of the council, the following letter. There is a new modernism full of pride and obstreperousness that seems to me more dangerous than that of Pius X's time. It was, after all, a rather strange spectacle to see all the bishops of the council, each one flanked by his experts, professors, scholars, and pedants, of whom a good number were off their intellectual rails, and of whom almost none had any wisdom. So it is in the middle of all this hubbub that the work of the Holy Spirit is carried out, end quote. He tries to justify this hubbub, which was an attack on doctrinal integrity in the midst of the council, as the work of the Holy Ghost. So there's this crisis, and he calls upon Maritain to draft the credo of the people of God. Now, keep in mind, Vatican II was supposed to be the council that clarified Catholic dogma, made it clear to the modern world. We would restate Catholic dogma and doctrine in an appealing way, not all this technical Thomistic stuff. And instead, people were abandoning doctrine everywhere. So what had to be done? Restate the dogma. So he creates the cradle of the people of God. But it did no good in 1968 because Paul VI, determined to carry out his reform, proceeded to demolish the Roman liturgy in 1969. I'm not going to go into that subject. That would take 3 hours. But by 1972, after he had wrecked the Mass and lamented the doctrinal chaos in the Church, he made his most famous lament, but it's never quoted in full. Let's hear the whole thing. By some fissure there has entered into the temple of God the smoke of Satan. There's doubt, uncertainty, problems, unrest. Doubt has entered our consciences. It has entered through the windows, which were meant to have been opened to the light. This state of uncertainty reigns even in the Church. It was hoped that after the council, there will be a day of sunlight in the history of the Church. Instead, there came a day of clouds, of darkness, of groping, of uncertainty. How did this happen? We will confide our thoughts to you. There has been an interference from an adverse power. His name is the devil, that mysterious being to whom frequent allusion is made, even in the epistle of St. Peter, end quote. Now, maybe I'm nitpicking here, but it seems a little strange to me that he would refer to the devil as a mysterious being to whom allusion is made in the epistle of St. Peter, as if he weren't the principal character in the whole drama of salvation and redemption. He's reduced to a mysterious being referred to by St. Peter. Well, his pontificate ended with his death in the midst of this total disaster. And then we have the pontificate of John Paul II. I can't go into all of that. We know about the Assisi events. We know he persevered in the line of rampant reformism of the Second Vatican Council. We know he had nothing but praise for the liturgical reform. But I call his pontificate a chiaroscuro affair. There are light and darkness in that pontificate. The indults that opened the way toward liberation of the Latin Mass. By the way, he was presented with a document that would have been Summorum Pontificum, but he was talked out of it by his advisors. But John Paul II, as his pontificate neared its end, he too, in the light of Fatima, began to recognize reality, that the Church was not undergoing a renewal, that the world, in fact, was in the midst of a global apostasy. So on the anniversary of the first of the apparitions, he speaks at the Fatima Shrine. And to quote his homily is to understand that Vatican II's depiction of contemporary man as increasingly conscious of the dignity of the human person is an absolute fantasy. Here's what he says at Fatima. The greatest obstacle to man's journey towards God is sin, perseverance in sin, and finally denial of God, the deliberate blotting out of God from the world of human thought. In reality, the eternal salvation of man is only in God. Man's rejection of God, if it becomes definitive, leads logically to God's rejection of man, to damnation. Can the mother, who with all the force of the love that she fosters in the Holy Spirit desires everyone's salvation, keep silence on what undermines the very bases of their salvation? No, she cannot. And so while the message of Our Lady of Fatima is a motherly one, it is also strong and decisive. It sounds severe. It sounds like John the Baptist speaking on the banks of the Jordan. It invites to repentance. It gives a warning. It calls to prayer. It recommends the rosary. The message is addressed to every human being. Societies menaced by apostasy, threatened by moral degradation. The collapse of morality involves the collapse of societies. The successor of St. Peter presents himself here as a witness to the immensity of human suffering, a witness to the almost apocalyptic menaces looming over the nations and mankind as a whole. That's what he said at Fatima. So there are two different voices in John Paul II. The voice from Rome to the world, all kinds of optimism about Vatican II, into religious dialogue and all the rest of it. But when he goes to Fatima, suddenly the four last things return. We have to worry about damnation. We have to worry about apostasy in society. And this is in stark contradiction to the entire program in the official theology, quote unquote, of the Church since Vatican II. In his book-length interview with Vito Messori, he admits that the four last things have been lost in post-conciliar teaching. And he also admits that those sermons based on the four last things brought many to conversion. But now he says the conciliar vision has replaced this. It's an eschatology of the church and the world, whatever that means. But then he goes to Fatima again in 2000. This time, he specifically invokes the book of the Apocalypse. Here's what he says. Another portent appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon. These words from the first reading of the Mass make us think of the great struggle between good and evil, showing how when man puts God aside, he cannot achieve happiness but ends up destroying himself. The message of Fatima is a call to conversion, alerting humanity to have nothing to do with the dragon whose tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, quoting the book of the Apocalypse, chapter 12, verse 4. God does not want anyone to be lost. That is why 2,000 years ago he sent his Son to earth to seek and to save the lost. In her motherly concern, the Blessed Virgin came to Fatima to ask men and women to stop offending God, our Lord, who is already very offended. So like Paul VI, he was conflicted. Part of him had the element of Catholic piety. The other part was wedded to this delusion of the renewal of the church on account of Vatican II. But in the end, he completely abandoned his optimism. Let me quote one other thing from him. His famous sermon, Ecclesia in Europa in 2003. At the root of the loss of hope is an attempt to promote a vision of man apart from God and apart from Christ. Forgetfulness of God led to the abandonment of man. A vast field is open for the unrestrained development of nihilism in philosophy, of relativism in values and morality, and of pragmatism, and even a cynical hedonism in daily life. European culture gives the impression of silent apostasy on the part of people who live as if God does not exist. What happened to the conciliar renewal? Yes, it didn't happen. So he passes on, having left us with these notes of pessimism, in the light of Fatima, showing once again the importance of Our Lady in the modern world. And then we have Pope Benedict. I speak of the Benedictine respite from the insanity of the post-conciliar epoch. He did great things for the church. He lifted the excommunication of the bishops of the Society of St. Pius X. He liberated the Latin Mass from its preposterous captivity on the false pretense that Paul VI had forbade. And he said in his explanatory letter to the bishops, it was never juridically abrogated. And he corrected some of the more egregious translations of the Novus Ordo Mass, including for you and for all. But, as he said at the beginning of his pontificate, pray for me that I do not flee for fear of the wolves. And he did flee for fear of the wolves, but not before he made his own contributions to the growing pessimism. In pronouncement after pronouncement, he talked about things like, quote, the darkness that poses a real threat to mankind. In another speech, In our days, in vast areas of the world, the faith is in danger of dying out like a flame which no longer has fuel. And then in another speech, he said, in the Old and New Testaments, the Lord proclaims judgment of the unfaithful vineyard. Yet the threat of judgment also concerns us, the church in Europe and the West in general. And then, lastly, he said, in 2010, moral consensus is collapsing. Consensus without which juridical and political structures cannot function. Consequently, the forces mobilized for the defense of such structures seem doomed to failure. The very future of the world is at stake. And one last thing that he said in light of Fatima. We all know he made a pilgrimage to Fatima in 2010. He chose the questions that he would answer. And one of the questions that he had put to him was, does the third secret of Fatima reveal the crisis of sexual scandals in the church? And here is what he said. It went far beyond that. He said, in the secret, and I quote, are indicated future realities of the church. Not the past, as Cardinal Sodano said so ridiculously, but future realities of the church, which are little by little developing and revealing themselves. As for the novelty that we can discover today in this message, it is that attacks on the Pope and the Church do not come only from the outside, but sufferings of the Church come precisely from within the Church. This has always been known. But today we see it in a really terrifying way. In modo verificante, veramente terrificante, as he said in Italian. The greatest persecution of the Church does not come from enemies outside, but arises from sin in the Church, end quote, exactly as Pius X had foreseen, exactly as Pius XII saw, and now exactly as he admits, finally, after almost 60 years of chaos, because of the forces that had been unleashed by the Second Vatican Council, and then he resigns. And then we get Bergoglio. Now, what can I say about that disaster that hasn't already been said? His hatred of traditional Catholicism, his systematic undermining of the Sixth Commandment and the natural law generally, including opening the door to Holy Communion for divorced and remarried, his coddling and condemnation of homosexuality and transgenderism, endless stream of heretical or quasi-heretical utterances, especially during his airplane magisterium, his war on the Latin Mass, his utter religious indifferentism, his insane preoccupation with climate change. If I could point to one specific example of just what a disaster that pontificate was, the arrogance of the man. He had a gathering of young people. They were talking about sexual matters. It was a Disney-produced documentary. The Pope Listens to the Young, some nonsensical title. And he tells these young people that the Church's catechesis on sex outside of marriage is still in diapers. 2,000 years of teaching, this man dismissed with a sneer, accusing the magisterium of being ignorant of the proper way to teach people about something as fundamental as the sin that causes more souls to be lost than any other. It's no coincidence that the name Bergoglio rhymes with the Italian word for pride, orgoglio. So we can only pray for Pope Bergoglio while thanking God that he's gone. It's over. But now we have Leo XIV. What are we to say about Leo XIV? I'm off duty, I'm reporting on church affairs. My attitude is, who knows? One thing is certain, it could be a lot worse. And the choice of the name Leo XIV is very telling, because that breaks the cycle of the self-referential Second Vatican Council. One of Pope Bergoglio's favorite words, self-referential. Nothing was more self-referential than him and his references to the Second Vatican Council. Leo XIV was an anti-modernist pope, no matter what his modernist promoters try to say. He wrote Immortality Dei. He wrote Libertas. Immortality Dei defends the Catholic confessional state and calls upon us to work for its restoration. Libertas condemns all the modern notions of liberty that have resulted in such things as lopping the parts off young people in the name of transgenderism. He predicted the disaster that would happen. He called it final disaster if we embrace these modern liberties. So this is a very significant choice of name. His appearance on the loggia in full papal garb. Our Archbishop Gonswine said that optically and acoustically we have reason for hope. Sure, he's made some very bad appointments already, but let's reserve judgment. We need to see what happens when, for example, he replaces the head of the Congregation for Divine Worship, which is now the dicastery for Divine Worship. That will send a signal throughout the whole church. But one thing is certain as I conclude. The message of Fatima is going to reach its fulfillment. It will reach that fulfillment in the consecration of Russia. And then Our Lady will take center stage in human history once again. But this time, it will be a victory even greater than the victory at the Battle of Lepanto, as Antonio Sochi put it. She will take center stage and bring down the curtain on the so-called modern world and usher in the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, delayed for far too long by the folly of men. The only question is whether the punishment for that folly will be the chastisement clearly foretold in that part of the secret we have thus far been allowed to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferrara. Now we have a little bit of time, I believe, before the concert starts. The concert's starting in how many minutes?